Hello, everyone. So, the financial Cold War between the US and China has entered a critical new phase. As we brought to you in previous episodes, we're keeping you updated. Imagine a high stakes poker game that has been raging for years. And in early 2025, the two players are now at the table. Washington on one side, Beijing on the other. Suddenly decided to go all in, pushing mountains of chips towards the center. This is a retaliatory spiral of tariffs, dramatic escalation of a conflict that began as in earnest back in 2018. Peaked with the US imposing a staggering duties up to 145% and China firing back with tariffs reaching 125% on us in return, 145 to their 125 on American goods. And just as the global markets brace for impact, a fragile truth was declared in May, like a temporary ceasefire in a brutal battle, which lowered those punishing rates. But tensions remain dangerously high. That's why we're keeping you updated. The annual U.S. goods trade deficit with China has now swelled to over 295 billion, a stark number that reveals a profound and persistent imbalance. And what do these staggering figures and these aggressive political maneuvers and this fragile peace actually mean for the global economy and for the US economy and consumers, more or less? And more importantly, how close are we to the next major flare up between the new nations? So, in this video, we'll break down the latest intelligence, dissect the numbers, and connect all those little dots for all of our perseverance pioneers out there between trade and technology, and explain what you need to know as these two titans clash in a battle that will define the 21st century. So, welcome back to our podcast and to our channel. So, the escalating financial conflict between the United States and China is, without a doubt, the most significant financial Cold War, as we've coined it on our podcast, an economic story of our time. It's like watching two giants wrestle. It's like watching Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. Where every move shakes the ground for everyone else with consequences that ripple into every corner of the globe and very likely into your own wallet as well. So today we're taking a deep dive into where this financial Cold War stands currently. We've been walking you through the Liberation Day, the start of all these tariffs. We've been talking about the 90-day pause. So we'll move far beyond those headlines to give you a clear, comprehensive breakdown of what's truly happening. First, we'll analyze the hard data on trade, digging into the specifics of the massive trade deficit and the untangling the complex web of new tariffs, which people are just now starting to wrap their head around, which can feel as complicated as untangling a knotted fishing line. Just was at the stream in the creek 2 weeks ago. Know how a knotted fishing line can dangerous that can be. So we'll explore which products are at the center of this dispute and how the numbers reveal a deep story of economic codependence, even in the midst of the conflict that we're all engaged in this financial Cold War. Then we'll connect the dots to the strategic and technological rivalry that's really fueling this fire and really fueling this Cold War of tariffs. The tariffs are the smoke, but the war for technological supremacy in areas like semiconductors and artificial intelligence, which we've already began to discuss in previous episodes, that's the burning fuel underneath the surface. And finally, we'll look at the precarious state of the diplomatic negotiations and what these tense, stressful, and strategic chess pieces all mean for the political climate on both sides of the Pacific that tell us about the ongoing future. This is more than just a trade dispute. It's a fundamental reordering of the global economic landscape and the American landscape as well, representing the most significant shift since President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. You can remember far back. Wasn't around then. So want to highlight that first of all. So being the decades-long process of normalizing relations and setting a new standard for the global and U.S. economy. So to truly grasp the scale of this financial Cold War, you have to start with the numbers. They say it's all about numbers because that's a good reason. It is all about the numbers because they tell a story. The story is of a staggering imbalance. The U.S. has run a consistent trade deficit since 1976 bicentennial days, but the gap with China exploded after Beijing joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was a questionable move, and many people thought it shouldn't happen. That happened in 2001. So that's fundamentally altering the global manufacturing landscape. Fast forward to last year, the U.S. goods trade deficit with China widened to an immense 295.5 billion. That's a 5.7% increase from the previous year of 2023. A clear signal that despite years of political rhetoric and targeted actions that started with the Section 301 investigation back in 2018, the fundamental imbalance isn't just persisting, it's growing larger and larger with each passing year. So the total value of goods and services traded between the two nations in 2024 hit nearly $659 billion with a B, billion. But the details within that number tell the real story. The U.S. imported a colossal $438.7 billion worth of goods from China, while U.S. goods exports to China were only, get this, $143.2 billion. The imports are dominated by categories like computer, electronic products, and electrical equipment, which together only account for over 40% of what America buys from China. Not talking about the goods, the hats, the shoes, the clothing, and all the American companies that sell out to China lock, stock, and barrel for their costs and for their products to get a better rate to quadruple their investment. So it represents a massive continuous flow of capital from the United States to China, like a powerful river flowing constantly in one direction, funds always going to China. A dynamic that sits at the very heart of this financial Cold War and this trade war, if you want to call it, but it's a financial Cold War to all of us here at the Perseverance Mindset Podcast. So by the first quarter of 2025, this trend, of course, continued with the U.S. importing a roughly $102 billion from China while only exporting about $31 billion in return. In response, the start of the second Trump administration unleashed an aggressive tariff action. After its rapid tit-for-tat escalation in April for the Liberation Day, like a furious boxing match where each punch is met with the stronger one, U.S. tariffs peaked at a stunning 145%, and the Chinese tariffs on American goods hit 125%. There was also a 90-day truce, 90-day pause, 90-day renegotiation time. It's basically a timeout in the middle of a heated game, reducing the rates to a still high 30% on many Chinese goods and only 10% on U.S. goods. But this tense pause is set to expire this month on August 12th. Beyond China, the administration has also placed broad tariffs on global steel and aluminum, as well as on autos and auto parts, signaling for a wider effort to reshape global trade flows, especially in automobiles. That was a heavily talked about topic in 2016 and 2020. Still rings true today. So China predictably has not taken this lying down. Instead of just matching the high rates, Beijing has implemented even more targeted tariffs directed at the U.S. Like a skilled martial artist hitting a precise pressure point to inflict maximum political and economic turmoil and pain. China's initial retaliatory tariffs in early 2025 specifically targeted U.S. agricultural products such as soybeans, pork, corn, even cotton. And as well as crude oil and industrial goods, Beijing signaled it will follow through to the end. They've got a war chest to do it. You think they care if their people starves? They don't. Hate to break it to you. If the U.S. insists on continuing in this financial Cold War, creating this cycle where each move is met with a forceful countermove, the fallout and repercussions of this financial Cold War is like a stone thrown into a pond. The riffles spread far and wide throughout the pond, and that rock sinks. So U.S. agriculture has found itself on the front lines of this financial Cold War, bearing the brunt of the Chinese retaliation. Soybean exports to China, once a pillar of American farming, have been hit particularly hard. To offset the damage, the U.S. government has spent billions in financial aid to keep American farmers afloat. basically trying to keep them from closing their farms. So part of the cumulative package here, as we break that down, has grown significantly since this whole new financial Cold War 2.0, began. On the other side of the ledger, the U.S. remains heavily dependent on Chinese manufacturing, because that's where all the manufacturing went over the last 30 years, for a vast array of goods, especially in sectors like machinery, electronics, consumer products, toys, and furniture, you name it. It's made in China. Even in areas where the U.S. has a traditional surplus, like services, the recovery has been sluggish, if anything. For example, while jobs in the U.S. supported by Chinese travelers and students have been recovering, which they've remained significantly below their pre-pandemic peaks. A clear sign of the chilling effect of these tensions, whether it's economic or geopolitical. Basically, and zooming out from all of that, the strain is showing on both sides. The U.S. economy is now is being projected to forecast. You know how that goes. Projected to slow going into next year. This is like trying to drive a car with an emergency brake partially engaged. An effect of high tariffs and soaring policy uncertainty during this financial Cold War of rebalancing the trade scale with China. This uncertainty truly isn't good for anyone. This is a direct contributor to rising, you could say, inflation, which hit 2.7, but over the last 4 years before even 2025, it reached the highest levels in 40 years. So it can always get worse. But when I go to the store, I know I'm paying a little bit less for the things I buy. That's all I have to say. So not only in the US is this being felt, China too is facing major economic headwinds, like a ship trying to sail forward while battling a storm. This financial Cold War is a compounding and its pre-existing domestic challenges. The country's GDP growth, once the envy of the world, is projected to slow around 4.5% in 2025. This slowdown is made worse by a severe ongoing real estate crisis that China's facing and a persistent youth unemployment rate. While Chinese state media projects an image of resilience and strength, the underlying data reveals a nation under a considerable amount of economic pressure. So just had to put that out there. So now we're talking about this financial Cold War with China. While tariffs dominate the headlines, they're just the most visible part of the conflict. Think of them as the tip of the iceberg. The much larger and more dangerous part, the war for technological supremacy. We've talked about this in many of our previous episodes here on the podcast. The AI arms race must be won by the United States. This is the strategic heart of the U.S.-China financial Cold War. The competition is no longer about who sells more products. It's a thing of the past. It's about who will control the foundational technologies of the 21st century and beyond. A new kind of space race for the digital universe. That's what we're discussing here. This tech war is being driven by it's a major shift in U.S. policy. By all means, that was voted for by many Republicans, independents, even Democrats. Anybody that voted for this administration believes in what's happening. To the extent of it's happening, another question. But particularly, its Made in China 2025 plan as a direct threat against the United States, launched in 2015. This state-led industrial policy aims to make China a global dominant power in 10 high-tech sectors, including robotics, aerospace, new energy vehicles, with its central goal to achieve 70% self-sufficiency in these high-tech industries by the end of this year. It's a clear signal of its intent to reduce dependency on foreign technology. In response, the U.S. has dramatically expanded its restrictions on Chinese technology firms within the U.S. The primary weapon is the Commerce Department's Entity List, which functions like a technological blockade, restricting listed companies from accessing crucial American technology, which we've discussed how China steals IP property, intellectual property from American businesses all the time, and all the cyber hacking that's happening. So this has been used to target major players, like many of those big Chinese firms within the U.S. Inspur Group, and as well as dozens of other entities listed China's military or involved in activities contrary to U.S. national security. This is coupled with a major push to revitalize domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Can't say that word enough. Manufacturing. Through the Chips and Science Act, passed through the last administration, the goal is clear: slow China's technological ascent and secure America's long term dominance in technologies that matter most. But the current administration is ramping up on this big by releasing its own AI action plan. But China's response has been a strategy of self reliance born of necessity. Cut off from key global supplies, Beijing is now trying to dig its own well, and it's pouring massive state resources, which it has, to keep endless amounts of cash into closing that technology gap. If there is a disconnect or a gap between the US and China, trying to even it out as much as they can. At the same time, China is using its regulatory power as a weapon. In retaliation for U.S. tech restrictions, Beijing has imposed its own export controls, of course. For every action, there's going to be a reaction on critical minerals that it dominates, such as gallium, germanium, which are vital for manufacturing the semiconductors themselves, and defense technology. So this has been expanded to include graphite and certain rare earth elements, demonstrating Beijing's willingness to leverage its control over the resources that the U.S. needs. So we said we're going to keep you updated, Perseverance Pioneers, and that's what we're doing. We're keeping you updated right here today. This is a tech war that is forcing a fundamental rewiring of the world's economic highways. New exits and detours being built in real time. The old model of hyper efficient global manufacturing with China at the center, it's now fracturing. It's cracking off. It's like an ice, basically like a glacier cracking off into different pieces. This strategic realignment is often described as two key terms: decoupling and de-risking. While some in the U.S. advocate for a full separation or decoupling from China's economy, many allies, particularly in Europe, prefer the term de-risking. Well, can't really get more simple than that. De-risking, decoupling, going away from China's economy in totally and worrying about those consequences, or de-risking. What is the risk of us completely pulling away? So this shift has also led to a fascinating phenomenon known as transshipment. You haven't heard of that before. To get around US tariffs, many companies are rerouting the supply chains. It's like sending a package to a neighbor's house first to hide the origin before it's delivered to you. It's crazy. Goods made in China are shipped to a third country like Vietnam, Mexico for final assembly. Product's already finished, but this is what they have to do to get around tariffs. This has had a dramatic effect. Both Vietnam and Mexico have seen huge surge in exports to the U.S. However, the U.S. trade authorities are now targeting this strategy as a way to get around the tariffs, threatening tariffs on nations suspected of acting in those ways and in that manner. Underpinning this entire conflict is a significant shift in the rhetoric of this financial Cold War and in the rhetoric of this economic Cold War as well. The language of cooperation and partnership that categorized relations for decades after Nixon's 1972 visit has been almost entirely replaced by a narrative of confrontation and systemic rivalry between the two nations, as if both sides have built walls of words so high that it's nearly become impossible to find a way out and find that common ground. In China, state media consistently frames a trade war as a fight against foreign bullying, against protectionism designed to rally public support around the government. And in the United States, the political tone has become equally confrontational, with China now officially labeled as a strategic competitor. Haven't been labeled that before. This is a hardening of positions that makes de-escalation incredibly difficult. With everything happening in the world today, it just seems it's getting more and more tough to maintain and have relationships like this. But what do? We're trying to rebalance the scale to show China that they don't run the table, that we do. Now, all these relations, everything happening today, is very fragile. The negotiations and any of these ripples that are out there. This entire conflict stems from a crucial, long overdue effort to hold China accountable for decades and decades of unfair economic practices. No one's really done that before. The attempts at diplomacy, therefore, are not a sign of weakness, but rather a critical test of whether Beijing is finally willing to address and acknowledge the issues that started the trade war and this financial Cold War in the first place. Most notably, IP theft, intellectual property, forced technology transfers, and massive state subsidies that create an unlevel playing field for U.S. businesses, U.S. consumers. And the 90-day truce agreed to in May was designed as a test case, pausing the most extreme tariffs to create a window, opening that window. So far, the signs are not encouraging. High level talks are ongoing, which is good, but they are categorized as by starts and stops with no major breakthroughs. That deadline is set for August 12th. So we're going to see what's going to come out of that deadline for August 12th. Like a ticking clock, U.S. officials have publicly described the talks as constructive, but privately, they're admitting they're stalled or that China is just running out the clock. This is a diplomatic code for China's unwillingness to make meaningful, structural concessions, which is the whole core of the issue that have been America's grievances for years. While China's Commerce Ministry continues to insist that any dialogue must be based on mutual respect, a phrase that many U.S. policymakers interpret as refusal to change any of the economic practices that got us here in the first place, that fueled its rapid growth, often at America's expense. The fallout from this necessary confrontation inevitably extends far beyond just the US and China. Major allies like the European Union or Japan are caught often in the middle of this in a difficult situation and a very delicate position. They're also pressured by Washington to align with a more hardline stance, yet they are trying to manage their own deep economic ties to China. All these years, we're not the only country that's dependent on them in a lot of ways. The EU, for its part, has adopted a formal strategy of de-risking, launching its own investigations into these Chinese state subsidies, particularly the electronic vehicle sector, and developing tools like Critical Raw Materials Act to reduce its dependence on Chinese suppliers. Japan, which is one of the key allies of the United States and a major economic competitor in China, is similarly trying to secure its supply chains while navigating all these cross currents, the geopolitical climate, the economic climate. It's really it's like a sewage, really, of everything out there. People just trying to make their way through to do the best for their country. So this fight is forcing a much needed realignment in these global institutions and in America. For years, China has used the World Trade Organization to its advantage since joining in 2001, lodging complaints against the U.S., against actions, while portraying itself as a champion of free trade. This despite the fact that the U.S. has historically had very high success rate in the cases it has brought against China at the World Trade Organization. The current standoff has, in some ways, in this financial Cold War, paralyzed the WTO's dispute settlement system, highlighting the need for the reforms needed there. In response, the U.S. is now working to build a coalition around the nations and other countries that China has also ripped off, that they want the U.S. and those allies to counter China's model of state-sponsored capitalism and establish new, fair standards for technology and trade going forward past the 21st century. So what does this all mean for you, the consumer? There are undeniable short-term costs. The tariff is a tax on any imported product. Who ends up paying it is either the business or the consumer down the line, and that cost often gets passed to that consumer. But with inflation that's steadily rising, but it's quadrupled over the last 4 years, again, it's going to be going up and going down. You're likely paying more for goods in general, all the way from those electronics to the appliances, to shoes and furniture. It's a direct price of confronting what decades of U.S. policymakers call economic malpractice. These are tough measures designed to stop the long-term bleeding of American jobs and the intellectual property theft and the billions of dollars spent on farm aid are another direct cost of this fight, but it's viewed as necessary. It's a necessary investment to protect critical American industry from the Chinese targeted retaliation assault. This isn't just a distant problem happening on the other side of the world. It is the difficult problem of our time, but necessary cost of securing America's economic future for your children, my children, and for their children. So, as we've seen, this is not just a financial Cold War, it's a long overdue economic wrecking ball that is overtaking everything it touches and just destroying. The United States has initiated a high stakes, multi front effort to correct a global system for the American system that China has, or China aspires to be. For decades, it exploited to its own advantage. This is a battle fought with tariffs on the front lines, a strategic war for technological independence, and in the background, a war about tariffs. America is finally demanding real structural change from its leading competitor and its leading rival. We've moved far beyond a simple trade dispute. We're in a financial Cold War. This is a fundamental clash between two opposing visions for the economy of the world. One based on free trade and fair trade with open markets and open doors to all businesses and countries, and China's state-controlled model, which is built on a foundation of IP theft, forced technology transfer, and predatory, that's what we'll say, these are predatory market practices. The United States is leveraging its immense economic power to force changes to that system, while Beijing digs in its feet, reinforcing its strategy of self-reliance and hoping to wait out America's resolve. The economic strain we see coming from this financial Cold War and just this tariff war in the U.S. is leading to a lot of things. It could lead to higher unavoidable costs of this global confrontation. The ultimate goal isn't a simple victory, but it's a fundamental rebalancing to create a truly level playing field for American businesses, American workers, and for generations to come. And to anybody whose nation is that flag right behind me, how can you possibly argue with that? America's economic sovereignty, the future of the global economy, will be determined by the strength of U.S. resolve and the outcome of the next round of high stakes negotiations and the political will in Washington to see this difficult but historic fight through a more stable and better deal for America. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've covered from other episodes, we're talking about technological dominance. We talked about the financial Cold War. We've talked everything that's been happening. We're keeping you updated, all of our perseverance pioneers. Now I want to turn the question over to you. Having seen the details, do you believe these tough economic measures are the right price to pay to finally hold China accountable? Forgetting COVID, we're talking economically here. For truly ripping off American businesses, shouldn't China pay a price for that? For ripping off American innovation, shouldn't China pay a price for that? There's a different, less confrontational path to rebalancing the scales, is there? We might have already tried that. And how did that work out? This financial Cold War, how has it impacted you? Let me know your thoughts, your stories, your opinions right there in the comments below. If you found this deep dive analysis valuable and this great episode and this great podcast, something you wouldn't want to miss, please take a moment, hit that like button, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button next to it to the channel for more content like this. This is John Zadzura signing off from the Perseverance Mindset Podcast. Thank you, and have a great night.